Today's guest is Austin Hay. Austin is the co-founder of Clarify, which is revolutionizing the CRM space. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But he also brings a wealth of experience from roles in MarTech at Ramp, operations and go-to-market positions at Runway, mParticle, and Branch. Here are 3 things that I learned from Austin that you all should pay attention to. All the significant changes in the MarTech landscape over the last few years, the resetting expectations on what is trackable in marketing, and finally, how the traditional concept of the customer data platform is evolving. So let's get into it. Welcome, Austin. I am so excited about this episode. I think I've followed your journey and seen you on Reforge and seen you on a whole bunch of courses. So this is going to be jam-packed. And I'm going to jump in with the first really interesting question I have for you, which is, you've been at some of the best B2B companies, mobile companies, CDPs, and you've worked with some of the largest and most recognizable B2C brands. So all I want to know is, who do you think does marketing and MarTech better, B2C or B2B?
Pranav, that's a great question. Yes, I've seen a lot of different MarTech vantage points from Branch and mParticle and Runway and Ramp. And in particular, I saw a lot of B2C MarTech experiences across a wide variety of consulting gigs. I worked for Walmart and Postmates and more recently Robinhood and Notion. So I feel like I've seen almost every flavor of MarTech and MarTech stack. In my opinion, I think B2C is the most structured form of marketing technology. I'm not saying it's easy, but I say structured because it follows a very predictable pattern. You're trying to get users, you're trying to acquire them from different ad channels, push them to your website or application, and get them to convert. And a lot of the pieces of machinery that you see in B2B are missing. You don't necessarily have a CRM in the B2B motion. B2B is, I think, harder, primarily because a lot of these ad networks don't operate with a concept of a business email. And I know that seems so trivial, but one of the problems we faced at Ramp, which I'm sure lots of other people face, is that when you're trying to acquire users from Facebook or Meta, Twitter, they often use their personal email address, but the email address you're getting when you're a B2B business is usually their business email or some mixture of the two. And so utilizing that in a way to go and acquire or re-attribute to the user or remarket to them is really challenging. And there's not a lot of good services that I know of that will have 100% fidelity between a business and a personal email address. So I think for that alone, B2B is really challenging. Obviously, the most challenging, in my opinion, is B2B2C, which are those businesses that operate an enterprise model, but still offer their tools and solutions to individuals. I think it's really complicated because you have all the complexity of B2C marketing at the top of the stack, and then all the complexity of B2B marketing at the bottom of the stack. And I would say Ramp was the first real experience I had where we were running as much as possible a really strong B2C motion at the top of the stack and a B2B motion at the bottom of the stack. And again, Ramp is a corporate credit card experience, so it's not like everybody can go and sign up for it. But we're trying to target people and acquire users and get them to become leads as if we were offering in a B2C manner. So, we're running LinkedIn ads, we're running Facebook ads, we're trying Reddit ads. We had a lot of growth experiments running, and we faced all those challenges that you see in B2B, like with emails not working the way you'd expect. And we still needed all the infrastructure of capturing users and leads as if we're a B2C company. So anyways, this is a very long-winded saying of saying, I think B2B2C is the most fun, also the hardest. B2C is the most predictable and maybe the least stressful, but it also comes with its own set of challenges around attribution, which I'm sure you know all about running an MMM studio.
Now that's wonderful to hear your perspective on all the B2B, B2C, B2B2C. And I agree. I've been in a few businesses that are B2B2C, and it's a lot of fun, but it's also quite hard. Okay, so You've seen MarTech evolve over the last 10 years, and you've had that very interesting vantage point. What do you think has changed in the last 10 years with regards to MarTech? And especially in the last couple of years with all the stuff that's happening with AI and machine learning, are there specific sort of pivot points that you have observed that have completely changed the way you think about this category?
Mm, mm. So I think some of the obvious pivot points have occurred in the mobile landscape and maybe in the web landscape with cookies. So if we go back to say like 2014, 2015, it was kind of the Wild West, right? Like we were coming off the heels of DMPs using cookies to create audiences that you could use for targeting purposes. Cookies were still very viable ways to track people persistently across website domains and traffic. With the advent of the iPhone, now we had a UUID. I don't remember if it was 2015 or before then, but at some point Apple said, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to let people be tracked with literally like your phone's social security number, which was a UUID. So they introduced this thing called the IDFA, which was effectively the same, except it could be reset. So that was a pivotal moment where like, okay, Apple has told us that we're allowed to track people, and they've given us a way to do it. Similarly, we have the GID that Google came out with afterwards, and maybe it was like 2015, 2016, the idea of fingerprinting users not only became kind of well documented, but it was put into practice at a massive scale. I think like 2015, people were figuring it out. Attribution companies existed. There was still a lot of knowledge that people didn't have around how it worked and why. And you'd see these pioneering companies start to use fingerprinting to get really good at attribution and then get really good at their paid or performance marketing. And from 2017 to 2019, I think that knowledge just spiraled on itself. More companies getting better at doing this. The tools and technology, companies like AppsFlyer and Branch and Singular, obviously producing better and better solutions to make it easier for people. The collective knowledge of the community powering those things. And then like as soon as people got really good at it and Facebook and was making a ton of money off of it, Apple comes in with like the hammer and just blows everything apart by getting rid of the IDFA and introducing SK Ad Network and ATT. And without going into like all the nasty details of it, Apple's always kind of positioned themselves as a privacy forward solution for consumers. And so they introduced this change to their platform for iOS developers that basically says, hey, you got to get permission from people before you can get their IDFA. And, in the beginning, it was maybe 40% of people. They had a rollout period. Now it's like less than 20% of people opt in to being tracked using SK Ad Network and ATT. Long story short is now you don't get deterministic data about an iPhone. You don't know who the person is at the individual level. You only know attribution at the aggregate level. And so you can imagine IDFA, SK Ad Network, you could see with high granularity where people are coming from, what actions they were performing inside the app, literally down to the user level. Now at best, you might know, hey, I spent this amount of money on my traffic. X% of users came from Facebook and Y% of them converted, but I don't know which ones are which. And I really have no way of analyzing this data further because Apple's the one providing that data through a mechanism inside the app. And I think at the same time that happened, Google has really pushed on privacy changes in Chrome to make it harder for tracking. Like you're now stripping UTM parameters from URLs. Cookies are no longer as reliable. They're getting blocked. There's many tools out there in domains that block third-party cookies. So I think overall, we're just seeing an increasing diminishing return on investment in attribution tracking. And at the same time, I don't know if executives out there have reset their expectations from the last 5 years. So it's an interesting time to be a data or MarTech person because you're trying to communicate this really complicated set of changes in the environment and also reset expectations with leaders about how you're going to present information and data and what tools are available to you.
That is such an interesting point about the resetting of the expectations. And by the way, the pivotal points that you mentioned, I completely agree with. And the result is that now it's become that much harder for a VP of marketing or a VP of analytics or a VP of operations in the marketing organization to say to the CEO, to the CFO, to the CMO, hey, remember all the ways in which we were doing things for the last 5 years? Well, now it's going to be completely different. And here's, why we need you to get on board. What do you recommend those leaders do to go through that change management process internally? I'm sure you've had to maybe deal with it to some extent at Ramp. I'm curious.
Well, I mean, I think like the number one thing that almost all kind of middle to late stage executives in marketing to realize is like, unfortunately, not everything is trackable like it used to be. I think people got really used to the fact that marketing could become incredibly high fidelity in terms of tracking. And that was great because I think never before in history has marketing been a very finite and discrete science. And so we had this golden period where it was, you could literally understand exactly where somebody came from, how much you paid for them, what the outcome was, and you could create models to demonstrate how you'll get ROI or not. And I think now we've moved back to a world where, some stuff is very discrete still. Maybe it's discrete enough to understand at a channel level how to make bets and spend money. But on the whole, we're seeing more that you have to either use advanced techniques to really understand how your spend is becoming worth it. Things like incrementality and MMM, which obviously are like just two tools in a toolkit of many, but they're highly advanced tools, right? These are not things that a startup with 10 people and a marketing team of 2 can really do. And there's also this conversation around like, do you have enough marketing spread to even make those tools viable? So in terms of setting expectations, I think it's just like being really clear with your leaders about what's feasible, what's not, and also maybe having tough conversations up front about how you're going to invest dollars and what you're not going to do. Because I do think an outcome of everything being very discrete and measurable is that you have these growth engines where you can just run tons of experiments and track things with high fidelity. And I'm seeing more in the market, people are still keeping the growth engines going, but the ability to track the outcomes of those growth experiments is decaying. And I think that is the big fundamental shift that I worry about is like, hey, growth is still going to keep the mantra of like, run fast and break things or whatever you want to call it. But if you're not confident in the outcome, if you don't have high fidelity in the experiment outcome, then you're just running experiments with no conviction that where you're going is actually the right path. So I do think that will just require teams to have more frank conversations up front about what to do and not do, and maybe slow down a little bit for the purposes of investing time and energy in the channels that are either more discrete and measurable, or maybe less discrete, but where they know that there's value intrinsically.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I love how you talk about experimentation. And we have a very specific point of view on this around incrementality testing and how you structure those. And there's a bunch of vendors who are doing really good work around this. What I find, and tell me if you agree or disagree, the discipline around experimentation or incrementality testing in a lot of businesses doesn't exist yet, right? In the sense of, how do you form your hypothesis? How do you set your test and control buckets, whether it's geo testing or user testing? And I find that that's an uphill battle sometimes to educate and sort of manage the process internally. Do you feel the same way, or why do you think that exists? Like that maybe lack of familiarity with experimentation within marketing teams. And I'm
Totally.
curious to hear your take if I'm wrong altogether. Yeah.
No, totally. And sorry to cut you off, Pranav. It was just emphatic in my response. I completely agree. And actually, 2 observations. One is I think teams race to try to test out these toolkits long before they either need them or are ready for them. And like I tell people I talk to all the time in marketing, like you can get really far with single touch attribution, like a surprisingly long ways with single touch or even first and last touch attribution. And that's not to say that like you're incompetent or you're not deserving of those tools. It's just that, unless you're running into the problems that come with those types of toolkits, there's no need to change course, especially if you don't have the resources to actually upgrade to a more advanced system. So that's the first observation. The second one is, I do think that these more sophisticated methods require a big resource commitment from the team, larger than I think people realize up front, and larger than most companies have the capital or people for. At Ramp, for example, we didn't really even start incrementality testing and MMM until, 3 years into the journey, 200 plus people. And so you think about like one of the fastest growing companies of our time, they're not even investing in the tools, people, and technology to do these types of advanced measurements until much later in their life cycle. That should hopefully tell people out there in the market, like, hey, give yourself some time and space to test the easy stuff and learn and master that and all the infrastructure that comes with that, so that when you're ready to upgrade to the next level, when you're ready for MMM or incrementality, you can really nail it. And another thing, which is you probably deal with a lot, is the thing you can master and can really do well as a smaller stage startup is get your data correct so you can actually outsource MMM and incrementality properly. And that is something I think people forget all the time, is like, hey, you might not have the data team of 5 or 6 and the data scientists with the knowledge and expertise to do MMM and incrementality, but you definitely have a backend engineer. You definitely have a front-end engineer, which means you can start collecting behavior analytics data, which will give you the opportunity to run MMM and incrementality in the future. You can always look retroactively back on historical data if you've been collecting it. So, and it's the same thing with first touch and last touch. Maybe you start with first touch, but if you've been collecting the right data elements for first and last touch the entire time, you can do that retroactive analysis and gain insight from it. And so if you're going to spend your time anywhere, I argue you should spend it on getting your data infrastructure correct up front, because even if you don't have the money, time, and resources to do these advanced methodologies, when the time comes to do it, you don't want to be scrambling and upset that you don't have 6 months of data ready or whatever.
That's a great point, Austin. I completely agree with you. And, in our early customer set, there are a couple of companies where we found that they had centralized all their data cleanly in a warehouse. And we were so impressed, because that is the hardest part of any type of marketing measurement, is actually getting all the data in a clean place over the last 2 years, 3 years, however much time that you have. On that note, I know that there's a lot of fascination with CDPs. Obviously, you worked at one of them, mParticle, and they've kind of changed in the way that they are sort of positioning themselves, CDPs in general. And you've also now seen people say things like, well, the data warehouse is the CDP. And, what's your take on what's happening in the CDP market?
Yeah, there's a ton of confusion out there. I get questions still every day on, like, do we need a CDP? What is a CDP? People are, even companies as big as, IPO-based companies are asking the question, what type of CDP do we need? And the answer is, like, a CDP is no longer just a particular category. It's a set of tools and capabilities that are embedded in lots of other categories. Case in point, right? High Touch is a well-known reverse ETL provider. They allow you to take data from the warehouse and federate that out to different tools. And they recently kind of moved into the legacy CDP space by offering the ability to collect analytics. Now, I would offer the whole time they were playing a role in the CDP space. Because if you go back to 2017, the core role of a CDP, if we think about like an infrastructure CDP like Segment or mParticle, it was to collect data, create audiences, and federate data. Those were the 3 value props that CDPs sold the heck out of 2016 to 2019. And so if you think about it, those are the 3 core capabilities of a CDP: collect data, federate data, create audiences. You look across the MarTech stack, and you can do those things from almost any tool or perspective that you start with. Say you're a big company and you had invested in Braze because you wanted to update your email service provider in 2016, and you instrumented a bunch of events. Now Braze has the ability to federate those events to Snowflake. And guess what? If you are using a reverse ETL like High Touch or Census, Now you can federate the data from Snowflake out to all your providers, and they have the ability to create audiences. So like, if a large legacy, player has Braze, something like Snowflake, and something like Hightouch or Census, are they without a CDP? No, they have a warehouse for a CDP, meaning their warehouse is the central source of data. They're collecting analytics with one provider, they're federating it with another, doing audiences with another. And so what I would say the big shift here for people to visualize is like, a couple of years ago, there was a very standardized ways to move data through the stack, especially for B2C, which again is the reason why I said it was maybe a more approachable vertical or kind of sector, because you would collect data in your in your true quote unquote infrastructure CDP. So you collect events and attributes about people. It would flow into your CDP. You'd federate that data out to a variety of tools like Braze, AppsFlyer, tools like Button, tools like Amplitude. And then eventually you would also federate that data to the warehouse. And if you wanted to do any type of enrichment or transformation, you would do it in the warehouse and you would federate it back into the CDP. And then the CDP would federate out to the tools. And you have this kind of big loop, data coming into the CDP, out to the tools, warehouse, and back. And what we learned from that, or at least I learned from that from working with a lot of companies who did this, is it is really complicated, super brittle, and it breaks. Because what happens is as soon as you want to do transformation data and you start streaming it into the CDP, and then you federate it out to your tools, you're driving up the price of all those tools. You're creating lots of data and schema problems. That was the reason why the whole like schema and data governance sector blew up. There were tools like Iteratively and Avo that both kind of grew out of that space and basically developed an SDK that sat in front of the CDP and said, hey, we're going to guard or gate the data that goes into the CDP because this is a kind of a fragile system. And if you blow it up with a bunch of data, it's going to be really hard to manage. It's like a database that your data engineers don't have control to. And so then, fast forward to today, if you have Snowflake or you have, another data lake where you're storing your data, your engineers have complete control over that. They can make modification to the tables. They can do mass updates. They have the control that they've always needed to modify and transform and enrich the data. So that's why we're seeing now the CDP or warehouse approach to the CDP, because there's so much control and tools and technology to manage warehouse infrastructure has become a lot better. And so now you're just seeing like the CDP category as like, you got to collect data somehow, you got to federate data somehow, and you got to create audiences somehow. And how you do that can be in many different tools. And you'll see many different combinations of stacks that never before existed or could exist.
That's a great reframe of the entire category itself, right? It's almost like thinking about your customer data platform as an ecosystem of tools that you have either, built in-house or you've collected, bought and integrated in a way. And every company is going to do it a little bit differently based on their unique needs. But I love that framing of what even is a CDP. It's not one thing. It's the use cases that you described, which is awesome. On that note, Austin, so I don't know if you follow Scott Brinker at all. Like he does a whole bunch of, MarTech landscape type of publishing. And I think the last one that he published, he said something like 11,000 MarTech apps out there, and it tends to increase by like 8 or 10% every year. There's always more noise happening in the ecosystem. So, you already kind of touched on CDP, but outside of that, are there other recommendations in terms of the types of tech that you would want to buy and invest in, specifically for a mid-market business, right? If you're like, I don't know, 50 million, 100 million in revenue, or 5-10 million in marketing and growing, what are the things that people should be investing in outside of the CDP?
Yeah, I know that that diagram you're talking about, and I love Scott's work, by the way. I'm going to preface what I'm saying by I read all of his stuff, and I've had a couple conversations with him. Great guy, and his landscape diagram, I would say, is equal parts truth and vanity. On the truth side of it, I think like there's always emerging companies out there, and it can be confusing, and also like a lot of those companies don't last, very long. At the same time, I think like realistically, there's not 11,000 options in the marketing technology space. When you think about the core verticals that most CMOs care about or think about, there's actually far fewer real companies in those verticals. And it also depends on what type of company you are, what sector or industry are you operating, what's your budget. You may not care about a lot of these tools based on your budget, and what's the complexity of your business. And so I think like all those things factor into this landscape diagram, but it's a great vanity metric for the MarTech space. So there's no beef there. But classically what I tell people when they're confused or looking for advice on their tech stack, because I think that's like the corollary question is like, hey, what are we doing? What are we missing out on? Like, can you take a look at our stack and tell us like what's good, what's bad? We just want to have a North Star metric on, are we thinking about everything that we could be doing, and are we doing the things that we could be doing well? And for the most part, I think like, the tools that you buy or build in a company are often a reflection of your size, stage, and needs, right? And so in the beginning, you're a startup that has $1 million in revenue. You're finding yourself in the go-to-market motion. You're going to have half a dozen tools or less, right? You're going to maybe have a CDP, some type of visualization tool, an email marketing tool, maybe something like High Touch or an AppsFlyer to send ad network data. But you're not very complex because the needs of the business are not complex. As you move up market and as you become a bigger business, the complexity grows, and you'll find yourself in a position where every use case could use a tool. And I mean, we encountered this a lot at Ramp, and me and my peer in the RevOps organization, a guy named Justin Tung, we did a lot when we first came into Ramp to try to tamp down the number of tools we had and ask the question, how can we solve this problem either by building it ourselves, maintaining that and taking ownership of it, or by doing it with a combination of build and buy with another third-party tool. And that's just because you'll have the natural spread of tools in an organization as you grow. People come into the organization, they've done something really well in the past using a specific tool, they'll buy it, they'll set it up, then they leave the organization, now the tool is homeless and nobody knows what it does. That is just the natural cycle that every business encounters. But I think in particular, what I'd said before about the industry that you operate in and the type of business you are matters. I just think that B2C businesses are less complex when it comes to tooling compared to B2B businesses, mostly because of this big giant elephant in the room called the CRM. If you have a CRM, your life is infinitely more complex and you have infinitely more marketing tools. You can call them marketing tools, you can call them sales tools, you can call them RevOps tools. They're all the same. It's the go-to-market system as a whole. And whether it fits into the marketing and CMO's budget or the RevOps leader and sales leader's budget is a different story. But as soon as you introduce that complexity of managing a marketing system, you have email marketing and sales marketing data in one place. You have a wide variety of tools that then populate around that instance that help you do basic things that a B2B business would do. So the long and short answer is there's not discrete categories for every business out there, but there are a couple things that I keep in mind. I think about data collection, data federation, and then activated capabilities. So your activated capabilities is going to be a little bit different depending on your business, but it's email marketing, attribution, data visualization, product analytics, chat and chatbotting. The list, the category goes on and on. And so usually I try to frame up business stacks when I see them in those three categories. How are you collecting data? What are the tools there? Where are you federating data? What are the tools connected and how are they connected? And then how are you getting capabilities out of those? That's a very simple framework for people to use if they want to.
I like that framework, and I think that simplifies it for people, right? The data collection, the data federation, and the data activation as sort of the three buckets. That's super helpful, actually. I like that a lot. Okay, so on that note, Austin, I know you are onto some new stuff over the last few months, and I'm actually particularly excited to hear this part, and we're going to bring it to a close right after. So you've been in MarTech, you've seen a whole bunch of different industries for the last decade, but you chose to build in a slightly adjacent and different category. Tell us about what you're building and what's the hypothesis and all about it.
Yes. I would actually say I'm not in an adjacent space, but I'll hope to persuade you by the end of this conversation. In my mind, RevOps, MarOps, MarTech, these all fit into the umbrella of go-to-market systems. And I think at least my observation from working with a lot of companies, is people are still figuring out the nomenclature for what to call these teams and how they operate together. And in particular, like we talked about before, maybe in a B2C company, there's just marketing, growth, and MarTech is part of growth. But as soon as you get into B2B and B2C, that model breaks down and you have many different variations of the same thing. You have teams trying to use tools to solve the problems of marketers and sellers. And I think one thing I learned at Ramp, which was really powerful, is that the best teams out there are starting to integrate developers, the developer experience, and technical resources into their go-to-market motion, and really creating almost like a dev-first go-to-market team. At least that was my experience at Ramp. I had a lot of time working with one of our co-founders and very technical, smart operators across the stack. I'll save that whole story for another day. But back to what we're building, my two co-founders and I, actually just a quick background, Patrick and Andre, they created a company that I just mentioned before, Iteratively. That was a data governance tool or a schema provider that lived in the front of a CDP that actually got acquired by Amplitude and merged into their data product. They both worked on the CDP team at Amplitude for a couple of years, and I had the pleasure of working with them as an early customer when I was leading operations at Runway. We'd stayed in touch over the years, and I think Patrick and I really fell in love with this idea of how could you create a better CRM that's unified and has a multi-product experience to it. And so when I think about Clarify, it's actually a very modern, kind of flexible data model and intelligence-driven CRM. And so what does that mean? Modern means that it's not only a better UI, but it's faster and intuitive, and it lives as an experience in the places that sellers and marketers live. So you can imagine, maybe the CRM in the future is not a thing that you log into, but it's in a tool that you interact with by email or Slack or even text or phone call. It's intelligent, obviously, because there's all this AI hype. We got to be part of that train, right? But jokes aside, intelligence really means like you integrate the knowledge that you have about users, you find new knowledge about users, and most importantly, you present that to your workers so they can take action. I think there's a lot of tools out there that just populate data, but do not suggest or even go the next step of providing actions that people can take to make their workflows simpler. A really great example that I always like to share is like whenever you prepare for a sales meeting, what do? You go find the person you're talking to, you research them, you find a bunch of interesting data, you see how you might be connected, you do some research about their company and their problem set. Okay, then you send the invite, you go to the call, you take meticulous notes, you have a million things you have to remember. Then afterwards, there's all these things you promised, you got to follow up with those. But hey, your boss needs you to log all those notes into a system of record, you got to update the pipeline. There are all these manual steps in the process for a seller, when the thing that they're best at is creating a human relationship with that individual and helping them be successful through consultative sales. And I think the future of an intellectual CRM is one that abstracts away all that complexity, the manual work that you're doing, and allows the sellers and marketers to just do their job. And the third piece here, we talked about, it being modern, it being, intelligence driven. That kind of the last piece, which maybe you're excited about, is it's a flexible data architecture. And this is where I think actually what I believe we're building is more of like a platform that marketers and sellers both can get behind as a single source of truth. For a long time, Salesforce was not a good system of truth because it's effectively a static database. It doesn't really allow you to capture behavior analytics. And I'm sure there are people out there who are listening and saying, oh yeah, we've tried to put behavioral data in the CRM and it does not work. HubSpot has done a really impressive job, I think, in the last few years of trying to build a behavioral data first CRM, but it's still lacking a lot of, I think, core capabilities that people need, especially people who are approaching their CRM in a warehouse first way. And so we're building a CRM that allows you to have a super flexible data model, one where you can construct any type of custom object you want and really visualize and collect data in a way that both serves B2C use cases and B2B use cases in one spot. Sounds easy, but is actually a very interesting engineering challenge. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing it.
It does not, Austin, it does not sound easy. It does not sound easy. No, it does not sound easy at all. So I don't envy you having to build this, but I'm also very excited as a possible future user of what you're building because the need resonates very deeply. Just having seen this at a whole bunch of PLG companies and sales-led companies and marketing-led companies, this was always a big sort of sticky point for all of our go-to-market teams. Awesome. So can people try what you're building right now with Clarify, or are we, what stage of the company are you at?
We're still in a closed program. We're just working with a couple design partners right now. Mostly don't want to ship something that is not going to delight people in the way that we want. But if you're a small business operating off an Excel sheet or Airtable or HubSpot or something like that, and you want to give our CRM a try, just drop me a note on LinkedIn. Obviously, I have my email address on there too. We're always looking to add new design partners to our program.
Amazing. All right. So that's the call to action for anybody who's listening to this. And go reach out to Austin on LinkedIn. And if you want to try out a modern, intelligent, and flexible CRM, you know where to go.
See, you remembered it. This is great. This is good marketing.
It is. You hit all the words that I should have remembered. So that's perfect. Well, Austin, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. I'd love to do this again when you all sort of do the big unveil. I think we'll have a lot of sort of common customers in the future. And excited for what you all are building. And thanks again for sharing all your wisdom on all things MarTech with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a huge pleasure. Love the chat.
Awesome. Well, there you go, folks. That was Austin Hay, one of the co-founders of Clarify. We'll have many more fun and insightful conversations, so tune in again next week. See you then.